presentation from St. Bernard history from 1945 to 1969. This is our attempted kind of an informal lecture series, and we've been tracing the history of St. Bernard from the beginning, from prehistoric times, all the way, we're going to do it until about 2006. The hope is that by the end of this, we'll come up with at least a manuscript or maybe even a book one day. It's informal in the sense that we're trying to get it together, we're working to get it where we'll have the story going through. But anytime that you feel like you can add something to the history that I'm going to talk about, because the people in here are maybe more experts than me on certain things, as well as if I'm making mistakes or anything like that, please let me know. We'll get all this recorded, and by the end of it, we should have a pretty good thing. All right, so in the last story, we talked about St. Bernard history up until 1945. So now we're going to see what comes after. I'm Curtis Manning. I'm a history professor here at the college, and let's just get going, because the last two times, against all my best plans, I went over an hour, even though I decreed that I would not do that before. So once again, we're going to find I'm going to do the same thing, and I'll probably be wrong again, because it just turns out, even though it doesn't seem like it, there just really is a lot of fascinating history. So the general approach overall to the story is that we look at St. Bernard history from the beginning. The way the story has evolved has been very interesting. There's been about 3 different geographical parts of the parish: Upper St. Bernard, Middle St. Bernard, and Lower St. Bernard, that have had kind of different paths. And it often works out that at different of the chapters of the book, like this is going to be a chapter, different parts have been where the action is. And once again, it changes. There's different ones that it changes. We've also seen that throughout the history, there's been a very strong connection to New Orleans. And in this chapter, there's not that strong of that. But the last major theme, which is the land issues, and especially hurricanes, and that's going to play a big role in this. In the overall story that's evolved, I think we found the #1 basic theme throughout, and that is that really St. Bernard history has been the traditional story of assimilation of a unique immigrant group, which of course started out with his languages, but in a very unique way. This assimilation story has been, I've not heard anything else in America, and also the unique culture persisted much, much longer than it's typical. All right, so we will, so that's going to be interesting. Oops. All right, so to give some of the national context of, actually the national state of New Orleans context to set things up, in the period after World War II, there's going to be a great increase in prosperity, population, and education throughout the country. And it applies to America, to Louisiana, and in this case, New Orleans as well. For population, there's going to be the baby boom, which is a huge demographic explosion from 1946 to 1964. So we generally, in human times, when times are very bad, especially economic times are uncertain, people put off having families. So the 1930s in America was very bad. People put off having families. Went right into World War II, where millions of young men were gone, and there was a lot of uncertainty. So about 9 months after the end of World War II, there was an energetic reversal of this putting off of families. And so from 1946 to 64, this huge increase is going to overwhelm pretty much all aspects of all institutions in society as it moves along. So as far as prosperity, the U.S. is going to enter a prosperous time really not seen before. So up through, of course, you had the Great Depression. The U.S. was stopped. The system was broken of democratic capitalism. Had lots of competitors. After World War II, though, virtually every one of those competitors were taken out. Japan, Germany, others were broken, occupied countries. America not only had increased its economy greatly to supply the things for World War II, but it is also going to have the world economy to itself. So hugely successful up until about the early 1970s. It'll be a straight line up. So prosperity there, and also with education. One of the cultural attributes that we've been talking about through our story is the education and kind of lack of reliance on traditional education in St. Bernard, and how that it served well. And so in the country as a whole, with especially the GI Bill, after World War II, higher education is going to go down to a much larger swath of the population. So essentially, the GI Bill is going to democratize higher education and bring it down to the working and middle class, which is going to feed into the prosperity and some other stuff. All right, so moving on then, first we're going to talk about Upper St. Bernard, and we're going to find kind of uniquely, based on the previous chapters, Upper St. Bernard is where virtually all the action is this time. That Upper St. Bernard is really going to develop into the parish we know today, and I'm almost going to feel guilty because Lower and Middle St. Bernard, where we spent lots of time, is not going to get much love at all. Just because not much is happening. But for those of you who are here for the first time, often we went long periods without ever talking about Upper St. Bernard. So it just kind of comes and goes. Right? So, interestingly, Upper St. Bernard is going to follow the national trends almost completely. There's going to be great industrialization and economic growth, prosperity growth, population growth, all that kind of stuff. And so we'll see that previous to this, we'd often talked about how the St. Bernard is isolated and lives off the land and kind of is separate from the rest of America and even the rest of Louisiana. But that all changes this time. The symbolic change is going to be the introduction of the building of Kaiser aluminum, and that's going to lead, I think, to a lot of other changes. But also there'll be expanded oil refineries and natural gas and some other things too, a lot of industrialization. But so in 1951, the building of Kaiser aluminum was announced. It was going to be a $70 million plant, and it was called one of the biggest booms to the economy of Louisiana in the state's history. The reason for it was with the Korean War, which started in 1950, there's a great shortage of aluminum for the military. So it's going to lead to this. So the plant was begun in February of 1951, and the first metal was produced on December 11th of 1951. So a construction schedule unlike any I've ever heard of in Louisiana or been part of. So kind of amazing. And so there are 9 production lines, 275,000 metric tons of metal was made each year, which made it one of the largest aluminum production plants in the world. And there was a 500-foot tall smokestack, which is still the symbol today. So 2,700 at the height of the success, 2,700 workers, a payroll of $95 million, and as we'll see for a manufacturing worker, a blue-collar worker, where generally the pay might have been $5 an hour, Kaiser, it was tough work, hard work, might pay 3 times that. So in this phase, we're going to see that continuation, that the lifestyle that did not rely a lot on education and higher education is still possible to make a very good middle class wage, take care of your family, all that stuff. So that's not going to hit home. Now, the next chapter that we go into after this one, we'll see that in about 1981, Kaiser crashed. And by January of 1983, it was just a shell of the company. So we'll see of all the prosperity that it brought in this period, by the 1980s, that's gonna change. All right? So these are just a few of the pictures of it. Interestingly, this is a little bit blurry, but of course it gives a little, the size you can see by the boat here, and here's the smokestack. But what I thought was very interesting was what was behind it. not being around here, so this is St. Bernard Highway, there's nothing there. You know, that's where that's what we're talking about, yeah. Right, and St. Bernard Highway, I mean, that Judge Perez now was just a shell road back then with good children and all that. But I was just shocked about, you know, I'd heard the stories and all that, but it was just, you know, a very big difference because we're going to see the population growth did that. All right, here's another part. This is a little bit earlier than that, so this is probably early 1951 or 2, something like that, because the smokestack has not been built yet. But note here that this is Fazanville, and we're gonna talk a little bit about it in a little bit. Of course, the Chalmette slip right there. And this is, I guess, what they did on the inside, and then of course there's the smokestack. And also, one of the current stories is the difficult, maybe, or the paradoxical situation between very heavy industry, especially the oil industry and all that, and St. Bernard, and whereas it brought this great prosperity, but if there's a need for a 500-foot smokestack, then pollution and other stuff, you know, we talked about the trade-offs between some of these industries, so, and then we'll continue with that. All right. Also, very, very important, it goes hand in hand, that the population explosion was amazing. We'll see that the reason I changed the chapter was originally I had a chapter in the 1960s, but the reason I changed was the stark difference in population, because it told a different story of the parish. So historically, 1810, there was just a little over 1,000, and you can kind of see the numbers. So even as late as 1940, there's 7,200 people. And so very little growth, so it took 90 years for St. Bernard to get an additional 4,000 people, and it took 130 years to get an additional 6,000 people. So there's almost no change, very, very small. We've been talking about the history of more of a kind of an isolated group of people and the traditions going on, all that. You can tell by the very low population. However, starting in 1950, which is when Kaiser came in, and changes happened after World War II, just an amazing growth of population. And so we'll see that even though it's past our story, that growth is going to continue until 1980. And the reason I put this up, and the reason I have the next chapter, is because from the 64,000, it changes almost not at all to 2,000. So it's about maybe changed 1,000 or 2 in population in that. So from a very low, stable population, incredible, stunning increase, and then absolutely stable again. All right, so of course we'll get to that. So very interesting. So of course, where did the people come from? It's going to be from New Orleans and beyond. And this is also time, especially in the 60s, with the immigration schools and all that. So the white flight from the New Orleans area, especially the Ninth Ward, the Lower Ninth Ward and all that, a lot are going to come from the jobs in St. Bernard. And they're also, I put they had to stay someplace. And I knew often in these stories, I kind of highlight places or people or things that I've heard in today's world. So I've heard of some of these subdivisions of St. Cloud Heights and Chalmette Vista, Airville Park, Carolyn Park, Battlefield Gardens, and others. And so I remember some of it. Did anybody live in those neighborhoods? Okay, gotcha. Okay, nice. And so that's the big story. That's the change in the working life of prosperity. But of course, politics and government go hand in hand. And also, the upper St. Bernard, as we saw in the last chapter, is going to come to dominate politics. All right. And the word and the terms we've been using, really we have often talked about upper St. Bernard being French and then Americanos. And so I would say in this chapter, upper St. Bernard becomes completely American, kind of unrelated to the cultural roots. And part of the Upper St. Bernard, the dominance that Leander Perez started last chapter is going to continue until his death in 1969. And I thought it was very interesting, actually, Leander Perez first spoke French, like a lot of other leaders of that time. So and this is going to be a continuation of the story that we've traced throughout of the idea of executive centralism that came over with the Spanish and French colonizers, where a specific leader has a lot more power maybe than other states. And it happened, it's going to be in the smaller communities in Louisiana as well as Louisiana itself. So he's was with us before, he's going to stay with us for a very long time and be very, very influential. And not just in what we think of politics, but really control a lot of the life as well. In the kind of going through these elections a little bit, so the 1948 election, when last we left the story, Dutch Rowley had been the sheriff. And if you remember, the sheriff is usually the most powerful position, though Leander Perez had become the district attorney because it's a little more powerful and went across both parishes. So Dutch Rowley had been the sheriff. He went against Perez a little bit, but as the pattern is going to go forward, he is going to make good with Perez and kind of come to an agreement. And so Rowley and Perez then will be on the same side. And so the saying was that Rowley and Perez buried the hatchet before the 1948 election. And Rowley said, I'm all for it as long as you don't bury the hatchet in my head. Also, when we had talked about J. Claude Miro, who was Doc Miro's brother, and had kind of gone up and down and had opposed and run afoul and all that, and so he had been impeached as a judge. But in this 1948 election, he's going to come back and make good, reconcile with Perez as well. And so he's eventually going to become the president of the St. Bernard Bank and Trust Company. So he kind of had to come to act a little bit. In this election, the Perez-Rowley ticket won almost all offices. Just one they didn't, which was for coroner. So an independent came on, Dr. Nicholas Trist. He'll come up later in our story. He was a country doctor in the mold of L.A. Miro. So it was a way to get going. And also in the 1948, Albert Estopinal Jr., who's been with us for a very long time, and he concluded his career and is going to retire this time. So Perez's domination, it really goes beyond, it's almost complete. And so it will be, he'll essentially get elected, virtually every elected official, as well as members of the police jury, as going through this, so like tax assessor, sheriff, clerk of court, voter registrar, on down the line. He will also be the legal advisor as district attorney to every governing body, like levy boards and all that kind of stuff. He will control all of the boards and all the people, on most cases, so much that he would just draw up any resolutions in his New Orleans law office. And pretty much all approved unanimously. And as he said, there's hardly ever a dissenting vote. We work together 100%. He also controlled, even more importantly, he controlled the judicial systems as district attorney, and then he would have the judge. When Albert Estopinal retired, he had his judge put in, he was going to stay with him as well. And so what he would do is he was the legal advisor to all parish grand juries. So if it was his people, the grand juries would never indict him. However, if it was the people against him, there would be the most meticulous, microscopic investigations on all levels. Then he'd bring up criminal charges and kind of leave them open. And so if the opposing politician or whoever acted the way he wanted, they would just stay buried. But if they did not act the way he wanted, they would be brought up and maybe go to jail and all that kind of stuff. However, around this time, around the early 50s, this great influx of people, the population increase that we talked about, is going to diminish his power a little bit, or make it a little bit harder. In fact, he very pointedly kept Plaquemines Parish, which was his own parish, he kept it very, very small so that he could control it. He said they could have had as many people as they wanted there, but he kept it small for the political control of the myself. Right. So, next big thing, the way these things work, so you get the power structures and kind of keep stability until something happens, and then there's a little bit of chaos, and then it goes back again. So, 1953, Dutch Riley died of a heart attack. He is going, at age 61, so Nicholas Trist is going to succeed him. He's going to win the special election with Perez's support and outpoll the other 7 opponents by 16 times. All right, so it wasn't much of a thing. And so like I say, this time I think it's going to change much later, but the district attorney and the main judge is a 2-parish, Plaquemines and St. Bernard. But these other offices like sheriff are just in St. Bernard. A couple of years later, Trist, as generally happens, the St. Bernard sheriffs kind of get a little dignity, so they start wanting to control their own stuff, and he did. He went against Perez, and thus Perez is going to turn on him. And when that happens, because he got a little too independent, Perez found some irregularities in the sheriff's operation of the parish, which included he suddenly discovered that the sheriff had 100 deputies on the parish payroll, most of whom were deadheads, and 75 who were not even bonded as required by law. So kind of what happened, he went against Perez, then suddenly the investigation started to make him think better. So by the 1956 election, there's going to be, it's a little bit closer, and there will be pretty much a standoff. So Trist is going to get elected again against Perez's wishes. However, Perez are going to get 5 of the 7 police jury seats. So he keeps the thing there. And there are often instances, maybe with the different, humors me greatly about the difference in maybe application of laws and everything. So in this election, in the Reggio ward, there were armed Perez-associated commissioners who wouldn't let somebody vote. But then the Trist-associated commissioner says if he's not voting, then nobody's voting. And then meanwhile, there were 15 of Trist deputies and 3 state troopers kind of milling about. And then there were some armed Perez supporters too. And then when that didn't happen and the vote didn't happen, the electric cord was pulled, so nobody could vote that day. And that's kind of how all these happened. So kind of moved on. So by the 1960 election, it turned out, so by 1916 it got a little more complicated, but a little more interesting. So Trist had gone against Perez all this time and stayed in power, but then what came on is that Leandro Perez had pretty good state level authority. He kind of controlled much of the state, but Earl Long will become governor, and Earl Long and Perez fought each other. And to hear it said, it's like they're fighting to death to see who would control Louisiana. So, in that happened, Perez needed an ally to fight against Earl Long, and he made up with Trist. But the problem was, Trist had kind of made a big deal about going against Perez, so couldn't tell anybody, because it would undercut all supporters. So they made these deals, the deals got out, and then Trist kind of betrayed the supporters who had gone against Perez. And so when that happened, when the deal got out, then the police jury led by 30-year incumbent Celestine Mellery and others are going to form a third party to go against the other 2. And so it's going to work out where the sheriff's race is going to be Trist, but backed by Perez. And remember, these sides seem to change all the time, as well. And then against John F. Rowley, who is Dutch Rowley's son. He's going to be with us for a while. And then the final third party candidate is our good friend Manuel Malera, who had tried to run a couple times before and had not been successful. But he's going to come back and run for sheriff. Unfortunately, we can't get to, I love to get into all the details because they're just very humorous to me, but basically, in the first primary, Rowley led Trist, but in the very suspicious second go-round, in the runoff, that Trist is going to win, all right? So when that happened, and Trist won again with Perez's backing, so Trist is going to be sheriff, but in that case, Perez immediately fired anybody that had been associated with the third party, right? Kind of got rid of all the parish workers and the people from the, even elected officials of the police jury and all that. And then also at this time, there's the president of the police jury is Valentin Reese, or Val Reese. He's going to come along later towards the Val Reese part is named after him. All right, so things are going well for just a little bit. 1962, Trist died, so then it becomes a Rowley, which he goes by Jack Rowley. You know that his name is John. That's Rowley's son. He is going to win over the Perez-backed Val Reese. All right, and so once again, when this got started during the election, there was suddenly an investigation, really on both sides. And so with Rowley, it just turned out that the number of employees on public payrolls controlled by the St. Bernard Police Jury, which was Perez back, increased by 300%, just between the two primaries. All right, and for example, the road district added 49 men in a 2-month period. All right, so of course, I'm sure that had nothing to do with getting the votes or anything, but had that kind of stuff a lot. And another name, which was interesting, that Sidney Torres had also run for sheriff, but he lost in the primary. He gave his support to Rowley, and that kind of put Rowley over the edge. All right, so Rowley's going to be sheriff, and he'll stay in St. Bernard politics for a very long time after that. The next step, which there's not a lot out there, so anybody has some good sources, let me know. This will be a good amount of research in the next go round, and that was with integration, the integration of St. Bernard in the 1960s especially. Leander Perez, it was probably the most prominent national segregationist by far. Maybe George Wallace gave him a little run for his money, but he's leading the charge at a national level of segregation. So as best I could find, it was kind of St. Bernard, obviously controlled by Perez, and fought integration. However, Plaquemines Parish got all the publicity and headlines and those kind of things. All right, so because Leander Perez was so upfront. But a few of the things that I did see, so Leander Perez is leading, trying to keep both Plaquemines and St. Bernard segregated, I think, and mainly from the Plaquemines side, during the 1960 school year, what he did was, Perez was going to create private school for Plaquemines Parish white children, so it's not that to integrate, because he's fighting the Justice Department at this time. And so he leased an old Ford Motor Company warehouse in Araby and created for 1 year a school, a private school to avoid integration, where the Plaquemines students could come and, outfitted and all that kind of stuff. But then the lawsuit kind of prevented that. And so he built a permanent school in New Orleans, a Ninth Ward private school, where the students went after that. So for at least a year, all this litigation is going on. Eventually, St. Bernard schools will be segregated in 1966. Leander Perez personally was the lawyer fighting the Justice Department to keep both St. Bernard and Plaquemines Parish integrated. He's going to lose that. Federal court order is going to prevent him being involved in St. Bernard with that. St. Bernard apparently didn't have the funds for a separate system of private schools, which was one of the choice of different parts of the South. And thus, St. Bernard schools are integrated. I don't have the kind of secondhand materials, but from what I've heard and And what was said here, that the integration was fairly peaceful. You know, there's not the same kind of protests and all that that might have happened elsewhere. So maybe someone can correct me on that. And then the Perez influence is going to continue on until he's going to retire in 1967 at age 76 after 48 years in public life. And then he will die in 1969. I just kind of he died instantly from a second heart attack. All right, so that also is the reason why I kind of changed the chapter, so that leads us up to 69, so it'll be very, without his influence. So once he's dead, then of course, whoever's going to gain control of St. Bernard politics will be up in the air. Does anybody have just a quick overview of the integration of Allow Men? What it meant, like talking to them,
At Sherwood High School, they had 8, when I was a freshman, they had 8 black students that started with us. And out of the 8,
do you remember that year about?
that would have been in 67.
Okay.
Yes, 67. And they used to come to school every day. They had an FBI agent that sat with them every day. That's why they was in trouble. But there still were fights, even though they had this FBI agent. And then by my senior year, the FBI agents weren't there anymore. But there was only one student left, and we had one black that graduated in just my 70 graduate class.
Interesting. Yeah, I look forward to kind of seeing more about all that. Okay.
And
Yes,
now it's about 60%.
yeah. Okay, so it was successful. And generally, in the general civil rights, the integration movement in Louisiana, New Orleans is seen as being peaceful relative to a lot of the protests that happened elsewhere. When James Meredith integrated Ole Miss, a couple people died in the rioting, that kind of thing. And interestingly, that and actually UNO was really I think, the first large public university to be integrated in the South when it was created. And so that wasn't the intent of all along to do that, but that was because SUNO was created as well, and that's what happened. So, all right. So another big part of Upper St. Bernard then, that it gets a lot, is going to be Faisonville. And Faisonville was an African American community in between what is now the Chalmette Battlefield and the National Cemetery, right? And it's going to be eliminated. Kind of the land is going to be expropriated in the 1960s during this time. And so basically, there were the two sides. So it started off with Pierre Faison is going to gain the land, kind of the land extending from the Mississippi River for a plantation, and kind of a narrow strip. He's going to give it to, unfortunately for historians, his son by exactly the same name, Pierre Faison. So it gets confusing in 1856. It will then be subdivided into about 33 lots, kind of away from the river. And it's possible, so the Faisons were free people of color, and it's possible that some of the lots were sold to some of the first slaves, but not for sure on that, all right? Or 2 slaves owned it, all right? So then kind of moving on then, for the Chalmette Battlefield itself, there have been plans for a monument to be built as soon as 1855 to commemorate the Battle of New Orleans, but there was no money until eventually the land, because there wasn't enough money for it, the land had been transferred to the federal government by 1907, and then the monument was built, and then by 1939 it becomes a national park. So that piece of land where the battle was fought had great significance, kind of federal piece. Then the cemetery part was established in 1864 as a union for Union dead. Union soldiers during the Civil War dead. But then from pretty much all the wars soldier will be buried there. So that was kind of an important federal thing. And also, around this area, we talked about Kaiser Aluminum, they've been going strong and had some of that land too. And so it's kind of encroaching on it. So with all that being said, as we approached the early 60s, it was one that there would be a move to unite all those properties, meaning really the cemetery with the monument part, the battlefield, into one continuous piece of land with this, in order to, for the 150th anniversary in 1965 of the Battle of New Orleans. However, it was unfortunate that there just happened to be this community in the middle of Bazonville, and we'll see a picture of that in just a second. And so this moved in, kind of gained steam. So basically, long story short, there's going to be community activists, probably with good intentions, to combine this in time as the big monument, a big place it is today, in time for the anniversary. So the key thing was that in this move, it was started by local politicians and New Orleans community activists. The one that seemed to have taken the lead was named Martha Robinson. So by October of 1963, it will go through all the necessary congressional things and get to be a bill where President Kennedy, just a month or so before his assassination, will sign the expropriation bill to expropriate this community, the land of it. And the individuals were not willing to, landholders in Bazonville were not really involved too much in the process. And then so November, the one road was closed. And by September of 1964, only 6 families remained. And soon thereafter, once they had left, all the structures had been bulldozed down. Right? And so this is kind of from a different perspective. Here's the monument. And then that's the community. All right? And then that is the cemetery over there. Right? So it's one, and in the current, there was a sewage treatment plant at the very end down here as well. And the rims of that are still there. So it's all going to go in one place. There's the house. All right, and another important landmark that was demolished about the same time was 3 Oaks Mansion. And I really had never heard much about it until doing some of the research. But basically, this was where the sugar refinery was. Yeah, and so there, of course, we know, especially with the LeBeau Mansion, not too many of these plantation houses survived. But it was built around 1831 for Sylvain Hero, a Creole sugarcane planter. And I thought it was interesting. The legend had it that Farragut, as he came up the Mississippi during the Civil War, he ran past the forts, St. Philip and Jackson, down the base, and came up and essentially took over New Orleans without a shot fired. New Orleans surrendered right away, and that's why we still have all these plantations and everything. But what I did not know, and I don't even know if it's true or not, but it's a story, is that a Confederate battery had fired on warships in Chalmette, or that warships in Chalmette had fired with a return volley, and one of the part of the volley knocked down one of the columns of 3 Oaks Mansion. And I'd never even heard in all my things of any firing once past Fort St. Philip. So I don't know if that's true or not, but it was a good story. But in 1909, Chalmette Refinery, sugar refinery, is going to be built, American Sugar Refining Company, which is Domino now. In February of 1965, there was an explosion at the plant. It was a big deal, which kind of showed that a lot of its things were antiquated. So there's a lot of pressure for Domino Sugar to revamp everything, to modernize. And so they had a long list of things they needed to do to modernize, take out a whole bunch of old buildings and all that kind of stuff. And it just so happens that one of the things was the plantation, which supposedly had a bad case of dry rot. And they mentioned that there's been 10 visitors in a decade or something like that. So, along with all these things, without any warning, without any notice, it's kind of very consciously, where it would not be noticed until it's too late. And in June of 1965, company officials just bulldozed it completely to the point that even the base was not there. And there was no evidence at all. And so that was a very big deal with people, with preservationists and all that, obviously. It's going to start, going to change some things after that. So that was pretty great. All right, so it's a lot happening in Upper St. Bernard, and as I mentioned, doing this story, though I've lived in St. Bernard since about a little after 2000 and everything, but kind of as an outsider, understanding all this, that when I came to St. Bernard, what we're calling Upper St. Bernard after this huge population growth, that's what I kind of knew St. Bernard as. That was the character of it after this, and that maybe Middle and Lower St. Bernard have been so small in comparison. And so part of that reason is, in Lower St. Bernard, it's going to be the beginning of a change of this unique, isolated, but very coherent culture that we've been talking about this whole time. When last we left the story, especially in the 1930s, and especially in Lower St. Bernard, which is becoming maybe down the road or way down the road, but in Lower St. Bernard, it was almost a good choice to live off the land, to have kind of a self-sufficient, but prosperous lifestyle, to not embrace the American culture of, working in a traditional job and having a higher education, and a lot of the changes that happened to Upper St. Bernard during this time, that happened elsewhere, of course. So we talked about all that, and it seemed a good choice, even through the 1940s, that in Delacroix and other places, it was the high point, with trapping and living off the land type occupations could provide this very good living and prosperity. So but we're going to find that after the 1940s then, say after World War II, there's going to be a beginning of change. And this coherent culture, Spanish speaking, kept together, is going to start declining. So, it's going to begin, I think, with what I've been calling the intrusion of modernity, like breaking this isolation. And so it kind of turned out that the speaking of Spanish and the isolation and these unique culture and the family-based atmosphere and all these things were kind of self-reinforcing, and so once those started breaking down a little bit in the outside world, modernity, which we're talking about now, is the first front, but the second front will also be land loss. From the 1930s and the dredging and the canal building, the oil companies, and on throughout there, kind of during this time as well, the Mr. Go is going to be created. But all that part is going to be detailed next time with the land loss. But it's happening this time too. We'll get there. But at this time, it's going to be more of a cultural change. And I was surprised, this is a little bit simplistic, but I see the big symbol of this intrusion of modernity would be simply boat motor improvements. So in the 1940s and 1950s, boat motors became much cheaper and much more effective. So we've been talking about maybe the traditional Delacroix trapping family, where when it was trapping season, which was lots of money was made, the whole family would go to the camps. And there'd be it'd take pretty much sun up to sundown for the trappers to tend all the traps and do all that. So you couldn't take a P-rod back and forth at one time. So the whole family went to the camps. It was kind of a family togetherness. Spanish was spoken and learned. There is no time for school. There's no time to even get back from the camp except for Christmas or something like that. So it's kind of this family atmosphere that kept the culture kind of insular, I guess, on that. Right? So suddenly now, in the 1940s and 50s, with boat motors, it became possible for the trappers to live at Delacroix, to live at Reggio, and to go out fast enough, efficiently enough, where they could handle their traps without having the whole family having to live. Of course, all these are very gradual changes, but that happened. So then, when that happened then, and camping, especially during tracking season, other weather was necessary. The next step is better educational opportunities for children. So beforehand, kids, certainly during that whole time, as had been traditional with self-sufficient societies, living off the land like farmers and other stuff throughout American history, you couldn't take away from the making of the money of the industry to go to school, but also there's an attitude, and maybe a good attitude, that education is almost wasted. Why would you spend time away from these money-making, prosperous occupations where you learn from doing, you learn from your family, and can provide a middle-class lifestyle, all these things, to go off to school where you don't do any of that stuff. All right, so school, there's an attitude of almost looking down upon formal education, and it has worked for the society this time, but also just simply the time to get there. However, and along with that, few of the Delacroix veterans had taken advantage of the GI Bill. It's kind of, why would you? It's much better to do that occupation and all that. So, just some stats then. In 1950, of St. Bernard residents, 5.5% had finished high school, whereas by 1970, 32% had finished high school. And the different stats reflect this, as well as the influx of all of them. All right, so, and then a few other things about often this full-time attendance at schools of Lower St. Bernard traces back to the 50s and a lot of these changes. All right, and there was, and in addition, there was kind of the dark side of education, which is also typical throughout American history, is that the educators, and there are good reasons for it, wanted to teach English and wanted to teach a lot of these prosperous things, but a lot of these things go against the traditional culture. You know, the same with Native Americans and a whole bunch of other unique cultures. This assimilation, which is this bigger story, has its good and bad parts, and one of the bad parts is this strain from the culture. So, and mentioned that somebody who had education in the 50s in one of these public schools said that she was slapped in the face by a teacher for speaking Spanish at a Delacroix school. Because the idea is you need English to succeed in an American way and do all these things, but that took away from the culture. It's good and bad with all that. So, once the education and the speaking of English came along, and so up through the 1950s, pretty much Spanish speaking, suddenly, as the children started learning English, and there's a lot of these other possibilities, then, you know, there's television and all these other things, the opportunities for American style life are going to increase, and many of the younger people are, one, not going to learn Spanish, and not learn it well, but also take advantage of these opportunities. And likewise, it seems a little simple, but same kind of thing with roads. Shell roads had come to Delacroix as soon as the 1920s, but really the so-called all-surface, which I guess is paved roads, are going to come in the 1950s. So before then, if the weather's bad and all that, you can't get out to a job at Kaiser. You can't get to New Orleans to do things easily a lot of times, not consistently. But with all weather roads of the 1950s, this intrusion of modernity, it's going to allow these greater opportunities and thus kind of whittle away at the unique culture down the road. All right, so then, but I think a big part of this are going to be jobs, where all of these other opportunities, not necessarily, so at first it'll be the trapping season or the shrimping season or whatever, we'll do that, but in the off seasons, find some of the jobs in the industrial plant, and that pattern increases over the decades. So, and just a few other little simple things that I just thought were interesting, that we talked a lot about the trapping season, which is kind of the winter part, I guess November to January or February, somewhere in there. But it was interesting to me that the shrimping season came right after that. So the shrimping season was April to June, So we talked about the great prosperity of the trappers, and during the 1920s, a lot of trappers could make more money than the government paid, right? But it was not just that, they would also go on to the other seasons and make even more. So prosperity was definitely there. And then in the shrimping at this time, the shrimp dealers would go out to the boats to get the catch. And so the shrimpers stayed out constantly, you know, for a lot of this time and working. And so just one of the stories that interested me, that when the shrimpers were talking about that to stay out there, they had to carry plenty of gas. And so they would pull it along and barrels tied to the boat and other stuff. And of course the barrels would leak, and the big cigarettes or sparks or other stuff. And they said that maybe 1 or 2 boats would explode every year. Like, it was a very dangerous business. And so they talked about hearing this boom and seeing a glow at Delacroix or in other shrimp boats, and knowing something really bad happened. And so the shrimpers being able to stay out for weeks also contributed to kind of the change in culture, because the family would not go, but just the shrimpers themselves. I was sad to see that the great popularity of the dance halls, where the 1940s was known as a dance hall era, that apparently by the 1950s there were still dances, but the Saturday night dances were not really family event, not necessarily Spanish speaking, and there weren't necessarily the decima singing and the Spanish, but like the traditional dinners and all that. So it sounded like they became more like regular dances for young folks and that kind of thing. And then apparently Hurricane Betsy blew down the last dance hall in Delacroix. And then a question that I had, which I didn't know, I don't know, it's more rhetorical, or you can tell me later if you happen to know. But it's fascinated me in the history that we talked about so far, that we talked about at Delacroix, that there were not just houses, but 3 and 4 and more houses deep on both sides of the bayou. And then I noted that at least in July of 1961, there was just on one side of the bayou. And so I don't know when it changed or why it changed and that kind of stuff. Because we've been talking, of course, the land loss is going to contribute to that. So that's a very big change. For Middle St. Bernard, like I said, I feel very bad about the lack of love for Middle St. Bernard, because not much is going on. We still have Manuel Malera, who we heard about running for office. Oil had been discovered on the Delacroix Corporation lands, and so he's kind of in some history, also known as an oil mogul, in addition to the other occupations we talked about with him, so he's very important. And it seemed like that, especially for Middle St. Bernard, it appears to me that there's been, we talked about some assimilation last time, that they were called torneros for the turn of the river, as opposed to Islamios kind of down in Lower St. Bernard. And so they had kind of started taking on more of the American ways, or the Upper St. Bernard ways. And so by this time, especially with the rise of Kaiser and all that, a lot of that had happened. And that a lot of the young folks were leaving for Upper St. Bernard. It seemed like there was a big flow to violence. And so up to this time, we've not talked about violence being part of Middle St. Bernard, but now it seems like there's been enough of a shift, at least when I came in my anecdotal view, that violent kind of culturally seems like it could be included in Middle St. Bernard. Some of the people that moved up there. And when I was around, it seemed like if you were making a difference between, I don't know if it's insulting now or anything, between, up the road was Chalmette, from what I knew, and then down the road, kind of was like it ended, maybe Miro was up the road, and Violet on down was down the road, St. Reggie or whatever, and then way down the road was kind of Shell Beach and Delacroix and these other things. So I don't know, I can be corrected on that later on, but it seems like with these changes, especially with population increase, that's kind of how it affected. And then also we're going to find that Betsy is going to dramatically reverse the migration we talked about from Middle St. Bernard in the early 1800s, started going down to Delacroix and these other places. Now Betsy is going to reverse that. And we're going to see that maybe 80% of people came back to Delacroix after Betsy, which meant a good 20% left. So, all righty, so, and just, like I said, there's not too much on all this, but just a quick overview, that along with the land and hurricanes, and we'll see that I had to put this up as far as hurricane history, that in September 1947, we had George, which was the first named hurricane. And that came from apparently an informal basis in World War II in the Pacific. The Pacific Fleet would start naming the storms just to keep track of all of them. And then that became kind of an unofficial thing, but that George was the first one that happened with that. And more importantly for us will be Hurricane Betsy. As we know in this room, a lot of people were affected by that. And so the September 9th and 10th of 1965, and so the 27,000 homes destroyed statewide, a 10-foot storm surge at its height, 9-foot storm surge in St. Bernard. Half of St. Bernard residents were damaged. Almost all the homes in Delacroix destroyed. Statewide or overall killed 81, injured over 17,000. You know, all the stats, which kind of are, I don't know, impersonal, sterile, those kind of things, with the real effect that we've talked about, and a lot of people in this room know. As far as the effects, we'll find out that I talked about the last dance hall that affected me for some reason. There's kind of a general, so 20% are going to not return, which I thought was a very low percentage. So 20% don't return to Delacroix, which means 80% did, rebuilt, embrace that way of life. But at least in the historical sources, it kind of talks about the end of a forward-moving culture. That after that time, the culture in Delacroix changed and became less of this unique culture that we've been talking about all the time. And so one historian, who's kind of the top historian of the second one, I'd say, outside anyway, talked about that the island of Delacroix never recovered. The once insular community had fragmented with evacuation and recovery from Betsy, but also talking about Camille, and that by 1975, the Langos of St. Bernard Parish recognized the need for an active, sustained effort to maintain the culture and traditions, and that others said Lower St. Bernard, the daily experience was not the same, meaning not so many houses, but part houses and part-time camps for people to come down there and fish, that kind of thing. And that another said maybe and this is maybe what I found too when I was initially came out in 2000, that the identity of these different communities that we've talked about, very distinct communities of Delacroix, Reggio, Woodland, Wyclosky, Shell Beach, and Hopedale, kind of instead of being very unique ones, kind of all morphed together to be that of a generic modern Louisiana fishing community or something like that. So who knows if that was kind of the general overall effect, at least from the outside. Additionally, the Flood Control Act of 1965, which was kind of in response to Betsy, is going to put the federal government in the business of storm protection, which we talked about after the 1927 flood, is when the federal government started the river maintenance and levees and all that kind of stuff. And then also we had in August of 1969, Hurricane Camille, which seems to be the most powerful hurricane ever, though it seems to have affected, but not that much. St. Bernard just missed us, and it seems to have leveled past Christianity. But so the stats on that would be the 190 mile an hour sustained winds, but they don't know for sure because all the wind instruments were destroyed, that kind of thing. But the most interesting thing about Camille to me was it was exactly the same weekend as Woodstock. The rest of the country was probably involved with Woodstock, but I'm sure it affected greatly this area and was Ship Island, which I didn't know that apparently carved Ship Island too. And so there's West and East Ship Island, but not so much. So, that was the history, I think. All right, so we can, and I just wanted to note, so when you see, most of you know that Michelle Miner comes to all these and was very involved with all that kind of stuff, but she was not able to make it tonight, so I want you to tell her when she does come, that I did make it in less than an hour. And then also that my refreshments that I got for y'all were much better.